Transparency International has released a report on this recently, and you have identified something like 176 properties, and that's just properties alone, with an estimated $4.4 billion of what is believed to be stolen, purchased with what is believed to be stolen wealth. A fifth of those properties allegedly belong to Russian citizens, and Ukraine is actually not that far behind, with more than 700 million invested into these properties. Can you tell us about the extent of Russian wealth in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the UK, it is a centre of Russian money laundering, essentially. And you mentioned this £4.4 billion figure. I think what's really important to note is that is just the tip of the iceberg, because this figure is what we found just by looking at open source material, so court documents, land registry documents, the leaks from the Paradise and Panama Papers. If it wasn't for those leaks, we wouldn't know about this at all. So the real figure, because so much of this is hidden, the real figure is probably much higher. As you said, we found £4.4 billion worth of money bought with suspicious wealth, and a fifth of that is from Russia. There was a Deutsche Bank research report a few years ago that estimated that about £100 billion had flowed out of Russia secretly. Now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly how much of that has arrived in Britain because of the nature of the problem. So much of this happens secretly. For example, if you had millions of pounds, I don't know if you do, you could buy a property in London anonymously. You could open a company in the British Virgin Islands. You don't have to put your name on it. Now, when you buy that property in London, you don't even have to tell UK authorities who you really are.
That figure of, I think it was something like over $900 million of what is suspected to be stolen money invested in UK property, that's just real estate alone. Do you have an estimation or even an idea of how much stolen money lies in other UK assets?
We don't have a figure because of the nature of the problem, but we do know that money has been flowing into other sectors such as education or luxury goods, or art, for example. Art and auction houses in the UK are very vulnerable to money laundering because the people that work there just aren't equipped to do the due diligence on their clients. And of course, art can carry, a single painting can carry a lot of wealth. It's a way to launder a lot of money in one transaction. We do, however, of course, have some figures around the property market, and that has been particularly problematic. I think of one property that's just a 5-minute walk from Parliament. It's owned by someone very high up in the Russian government who earns roughly £112,000 a year. This property, actually it's two properties, we reckon are worth between 11 and 15 million. So this person, this politician, would have to save every single penny of his salary for 100 years, not spend any of it, for 100 years in order to afford this property, which of course raises the question, well, where did this money come from?
And also your report outlines how a lot of this money is used to purchase visas under what is, I believe, called the Golden Visa Scheme. And there's been recent reports and recent there's been recent articles about this, and it talks about how Russians are some of the biggest investors in this Golden Visa Scheme, which basically allows them to invest large amounts of money in UK assets, and that then gives them the permission to reside and even later on get citizenship in the UK. Can you tell us about that scheme? And as far as I understand it, it's completely legal. How does it work, and how many Russians are estimated to have purchased visas or citizenships through this scheme in the UK?
Sure, so the UK's Golden Visa Scheme was set up in 2008, and for the first 7 years of its operation, it didn't have any anti-money laundering checks, which is really worrying for us. So the Home Office would grant the visa with the promise of investment. So they'd grant the visa before the money had been put into a UK bank account, expecting that the banks, the financial institutions, would do the anti-money laundering checks, right? Of course, when the money came into the financial institutions, if they had some suspicions over the person that was applying and the source of their wealth, they'd say, hang on, the Home Office has just granted them a visa. I'm sure it's fine, they must be legit. And they wouldn't do any of the enhanced due diligence checks. Now, 3,000 people in total applied for a visa between what we call the blind faith periods, that's 2008 to 2015, bringing in a minimum of £3 billion. 23% of those people were Russian, The only group of individuals that beats the Russian contingent was individuals from China. How it works is if you have £2 million, you promise to and put it in a UK bank account for a while, you can take it out later, and then you can apply for permanent residency within 5 years. Now if you're even richer and you can put in £10 million, you can apply for permanent residency within 2 years. So the reason we think as well that this scheme was used to launder money is because when the government introduced the money laundering checks in 2015, the number of applications dropped sharply. Which gives us real cause for concern.
And earlier this year, obviously there was the widely reported incident where a former Russian intelligence officer, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia were poisoned, which prompted the UK to take action, and that led to diplomatic expulsions. Is this expected to have an impact on the amount of Russian wealth flowing through the UK and the number of Russian citizens gaining visas and citizenship through this scheme?
It's a very interesting question. I think only time will tell. I have seen some noises in London from some lawyers, for example, that work with Russian citizens saying, oh, now you're bringing in some of these measures, Russians won't come here. So for example, they often cite something called an unexplained wealth order, which is where the UK law enforcement can go to an individual who may be a politician from overseas or has links to serious crime, and their known income is really not enough to buy the massive mansions that they're buying in London. They can say, please explain to us the source of your wealth. And this was something that came into force after this diplomatic crisis, although it was already on track to happen. What's interesting is lots of people are saying right now Russians aren't going to come here. What's interesting about that is that tools like this cannot actually be used as a political football. They can only be used against people who are either involved in corruption or serious crime. So it's interesting that there's this noise, oh, Russian individuals are going to be leaving. Either they've misunderstood the law, or some of them are involved in serious crime and corruption, and that's why they're worried about this.
The unexplained wealth order is something that Transparency International has been calling for. What kind of long-term impacts do you expect this to have on Russian money laundering in the UK?
Well, before we had the unexplained wealth order, our law enforcement were really dependent in order to seize an asset, in order to seize a property, either on a conviction for that person in their origin state, a conviction of corruption or serious crime, or enough information coming from the law enforcement in that origin state. Now, obviously in many countries, convictions for corruption sometimes don't come about for decades or ever, particularly if a country is in crisis or a country has a government within which a lot of corruption happens, right? And in terms of sharing information, unfortunately, dirty money can cross borders unhindered, police can't. So they're really reliant on the right information coming from the law enforcement in that country, and we've seen in certain cases, you know, the allegations that bribes have been paid to that law enforcement to stop them giving the information to the British police. So their hands were kind of tied in terms of being able to build up enough evidence to take to the court. Now, what the unexplained wealth order does is it gives police an opportunity to build further evidence. So let's say I'm the health minister, country outside Europe, and my annual salary is $30,000 and I've just bought two £10 million mansions, and there's nothing in my asset declarations to suggest I could afford that. Law enforcement can now come to me and say, hey, look, huge gap between your income and your asset. Maybe it's fine, just show us proof of the legitimate income, show us what we've missed here. If I can do that, they're like, okay. If I'm unable to do that, they can use the fact that I cannot explain where this wealth came from as additional evidence that they can then take to a High Court judge and potentially seize the asset. So I'm really hoping if the UK government implements this law and uses it wisely and uses it well, that we'll see more assets being seized, and therefore the UK won't be seen as such an easy place, which it is at the moment. It won't be seen as such an easy place to hide your money if it's dirty. And I hope that'll mean we'll see less dirty money coming in and more assets being seized and returned to the Russian citizens, returned to citizens of Ukraine and citizens around the world from which this money has been stolen from in the first place.
And Theresa, following the Skripal attack, Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, said that some 700 Russian citizens have come through this visa scheme, and they are looking at reviewing the visa scheme itself. What kind of is it going to have an impact on the people that are already there, and what kind of an impact can it have on Russians who are wanting to use the scheme to come into the UK in the future?
So in terms of impact, so we are calling on the government at Transparency International, we are calling them to look not just at the 700 Russians but the 3,000 people that came through the system between 2008 and 2015 where there were no money laundering checks done. Now Theresa May said very briefly there'll be a review. We've written to the Home Secretary a couple of months ago saying, please give us more information. Will this look at the golden visa part of this? Will you look at the people that came through in the blind faith period? So far we've heard nothing back. So I am not yet reassured they will really properly review this. The question is still out on that. In terms of Russians coming in future, I think if I think it's fine for Russian citizens to come to the UK if they've got legitimate, honestly gained money, if they're not involved in corruption or crime. And now that there are further money laundering checks in place, yes, I hope it will deter and put off those that will be bringing corrupt money and have a history of criminal activity. I hope they will be put off from coming, but I also hope that honest Russian citizens that have hard-earned, honest money won't be put off from coming to the UK, and that they will still feel welcome.